There was once a moment in history where the Roman Empire, the most powerful military machine on the planet, an empire that conquered half the known world, that built roads still standing today, that created laws that shaped civilization for 2,000 years, nearly collapsed. Not because of barbarian invasions, not because of economic collapse, not because of plague or war or famine. It collapsed because a 14-year-old girl decided to become a god and then demanded to marry a man and then got murdered by her own grandmother's soldiers and then had her entire existence erased from history so thoroughly that for 2,000 years, we've been trying to figure out what actually happened. This is the story of Elagabalus, and if you think you know what's coming, you don't. Because this isn't just a story about scandal. It's not just a story about a crazy teenager with too much power. It's a story about power itself. It's a story about tradition and how fragile it really is. It's a story about the cost of defying the status quo. And it's a story about how history gets written by the people who win, not by the people who deserve to be remembered. Before we go any further, I need to know, where are you watching this right now? Are you on your phone, your couch, your bed, your bathroom break at work, your lunch break, your gym? Seriously, comment that below because I genuinely want to know. I want to know who's about to have their mind completely blown by the most insane story in ancient history. Also, if you're not subscribed yet, do that right now. Hit that subscribe button, because the next 2 hours, and I mean that literally, are going to make you question everything you thought you knew about the Roman Empire, about power, about identity, about what it means to break the rules and challenge the status quo in a world that absolutely will not tolerate it. Let's begin. To understand how a 14-year-old girl became the most powerful person in the world, we need to understand the state of Rome in the year 218 AD. The Roman Empire was dying. Not slowly, not gracefully, dying catastrophically from the inside out. The economy was collapsing. The currency had been devalued so many times that people barely trusted it anymore. Inflation was skyrocketing. The wealth gap between the rich and the poor had become so extreme that Rome was essentially a nation of billionaires and starving peasants, with almost nothing in between. The military was fractured. Soldiers weren't getting paid reliably. They weren't getting supplies reliably. They weren't getting leadership that made sense. The empire had become so large, so spread out, so complicated that it was almost impossible to govern effectively. The military was split into different factions, and different generals were essentially running their own little empires within the larger empire. The Senate was corrupt beyond recognition. Senators were buying positions. Senators were selling influence. Senators were making laws that benefited themselves and their friends, not the people. And most importantly, the Senate was divided. Different factions were fighting for power. Different families were jockeying for position. It was less of a governmental body and more of a gang war happening in official buildings. And the people? The people were confused. They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't know who was in charge. They didn't know if Rome was going to survive another decade. There was a sense of doom hanging over the entire empire. Into this chaos stepped a man named Macrinus. He became emperor in 217 AD, and immediately it became clear that he was absolutely not the person Rome needed. Macrinus was weak. He was indecisive. He was unpopular with the military. He was unpopular with the Senate. He was unpopular with the people. He lasted about 14 months before everyone basically gave up on him and decided that they needed someone else, anyone else, someone who could restore order to the chaos. The problem was who? There was no obvious successor, no clear power structure, no one person who everyone agreed should be in charge. This was the perfect opportunity for someone with ambition, resources, and political cunning to seize power. And that's where Maisa comes in. Maisa was a woman of extraordinary power and influence, even though almost nobody knows her name today. She was born into a prominent Syrian family. She married a man named Julius Avitus, who was a senator and military commander. Through her husband, she became connected to the imperial family. She had a sister. Her sister was married to the emperor Septimius Severus. That's huge. That connection to the imperial family gave Maisa access to power, wealth, and influence beyond what most people could even imagine. When Septimius Severus died, his sons took over. One of them, Caracalla, became emperor. Caracalla was even worse than Macrinus. He was violent, unstable, paranoid, and absolutely hated by most of Rome. But he was in power, and Mesa benefited from that. As the sister of an empress, Mesa was wealthy. Mesa was respected. Mesa had power. But then Caracalla was assassinated by his own soldiers, and suddenly Mesa's position became precarious. With Caracalla dead, Mesa lost her direct connection to the throne. She lost her direct access to imperial power. The new emperor, Macrinus, didn't really care about Mesa. He didn't owe her anything. He didn't need her, so Mesa had to do something. She had to secure her family's position in a way that would ensure they remained powerful, no matter what happened politically. This is where we get to Elagabalus. Elagabalus was Mesa's granddaughter. Her name was actually something like Varia Avita Elagabal. Historians are not entirely sure of her exact name, because most records were destroyed after her death. She was born around 203 or 204 AD in the Syrian city of Emesa. She came from a family of priests. Her family controlled a huge temple dedicated to the sun god, also called Elagabal. The sun god was enormously important in Syria. It was the main deity worshipped in Elagabalus's region, and the priests of the sun god had significant power and influence. They were respected. They were wealthy. They commanded religious authority that rivaled any political authority. Elagabalus became a priestess in her family's temple. This was actually a powerful position for a woman, especially in the early 3rd century AD. Women in Rome had almost no power. They couldn't own property independently. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold political office. They couldn't do much of anything without a man's permission. But as a priestess, Elagabalus had agency. She had authority. She had respect. She was performing religious rituals. She was communing with the divine. She was someone significant in her community. But Mesa wanted more for her granddaughter than just being a religious authority in a Syrian city. Mesa had bigger plans. Here's the thing about power in the late Roman Empire. It was incredibly fluid. It wasn't stable. It wasn't inherited in a clear, predetermined way. Yes, there were traditions about succession, but those traditions were breakable, and powerful people knew this. Powerful people were always looking for ways to break those traditions and seize power for themselves or their families. Mesa decided that her granddaughter was going to become emperor. Not in some distant future, not as a long-term goal. Right now, while Macrinus was still in power, right now while the empire was still in chaos. This sounds insane. This sounds like the ravings of a delusional woman. But here's the thing, it wasn't actually that insane. It was audacious, yes. It was risky, absolutely. But it wasn't impossible, because the military was the key to power in Rome. If you controlled the military, you controlled Rome. And Mesa knew the right people in the military. Here's what Mesa did. She knew that the current emperor, Macrinus, was hated by the soldiers. The soldiers weren't getting paid. The soldiers weren't getting supplies. The soldiers were angry. They wanted a change, so Mesa spread a rumor. She told people that her granddaughter, Elagabalus, was actually the illegitimate daughter of the previous emperor, Caracalla. This was almost certainly not true. Caracalla probably never even met Elagabalus. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was what people would believe. Caracalla had been popular with the military, even though he was terrible in every other way. The soldiers had liked him because he paid them well and treated them with respect. So the rumor that Elagabalus was Caracalla's daughter created a powerful narrative. It meant that by supporting Elagabalus, the soldiers would be supporting the legacy of the emperor they had actually liked and respected. Mesa used her contacts. She bribed military leaders. She promised them that if they supported her granddaughter, they would be rewarded. They would get more pay. They would get more prestige. They would get more power, and it worked. The military decided to support Elagabalus. In the year 218 AD, just 1 year after Macrinus became emperor, the soldiers revolted. They declared that they were rejecting Macrinus and declaring Elagabalus as the new emperor of Rome. Macrinus tried to fight back. He sent his own military forces to stop them. There was actually a battle, but Macrinus's forces were defeated. Macrinus himself tried to flee. He was caught and executed, and just like that, a 14-year-old girl from Syria became the most powerful person in the world. Elagabalus became the Roman emperor. She took the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. She became the supreme leader of an empire that spanned 3 continents. She had absolute authority, absolute power. Absolute control. The senators probably didn't believe it was happening. They had no choice in the matter. The military had made their decision, and in Rome the military was supreme. What the military wanted, the military got. The people of Rome didn't know what to think. They had just gotten rid of one unpopular emperor, and now they had a new one. Would this one be better? Would this one be worse? Nobody knew. But at least something was changing. At least someone new was in charge. Elagabalus rode into Rome as emperor, a 14-year-old girl, a Syrian priestess, a person who had never been to Rome before in her life, a person who spoke a language the Romans barely understood, a person who had no experience in politics, military strategy, or governance. And she had absolute power. When Elagabalus arrived in Rome, she immediately did something unprecedented. She called a meeting with the Senate. She walked into the Senate chamber, a teenage girl surrounded by military guards, wearing priestly robes, and announced what she intended to do. She was going to completely reorganize Rome's entire religious system. The Senate must have thought she was joking, or having some kind of mental breakdown, because what she was proposing was absolutely insane. See, Rome had a religious system that had evolved over centuries. It was complicated and somewhat inconsistent, but it was familiar. Romans knew how to navigate it. They knew which gods to pray to. They knew which temples to visit. They knew the rituals and the traditions. It had been working, or at least it had been functional, for hundreds of years. Elagabalus looked at this system and said, "Wrong. All of it is wrong, and we need to change it immediately." She declared that the sun god, Elagabal, her family's god from Syria, was superior to all of Rome's traditional gods. Jupiter? Inferior. Mars? Inferior. Venus? Inferior. All of them were subordinate to the sun god, and since Elagabalus was the priestess of the sun god, that meant she was also spiritually superior to all the other religious authorities in Rome. More than that, Elagabalus declared that she wasn't just a priestess of the sun god. She declared that she was the sun god. The god had inhabited her body. She was the literal divine presence of the sun god walking around Rome in human form. The Senate was stunned. The traditional priests were outraged. People who had spent their entire lives serving Jupiter and Mars suddenly found out that they had been worshipping the wrong gods. All their religious devotion, all their ritual observance, all their spiritual practice, it was all wrong. And now they needed to reorganize everything around this teenage Syrian priestess. But here's the thing. Elagabalus wasn't done. She wasn't satisfied with just reshuffling the religious hierarchy. She wanted to make physical, architectural changes as well. She ordered that a massive temple be built in Rome dedicated to the sun god. This temple would be bigger than any temple Rome had ever built before. This temple would be the spiritual center of the empire. This temple would be so enormous, so impressive, so undeniable that everyone would have to acknowledge the supremacy of the sun god. She also demanded that the most sacred stone of Rome, a stone that was believed to be connected to a different goddess, be moved to this new temple and placed under the authority of the sun god. This stone had been in Rome for centuries. It was associated with the goddess Vesta. Moving it would be seen as a fundamental desecration of Roman religious tradition, and Elagabalus ordered it done anyway. The construction began. Workers started building the temple. The stone was moved. Elagabalus watched as her vision began to take physical form in the city of Rome. The senators were horrified. But what could they do? The military was on Elagabalus's side. The soldiers had put her in power. The soldiers were loyal to her. If the Senate tried to resist, the military would simply execute them. So the Senate reluctantly allowed this desecration of their religious traditions to proceed. But tension was building. The traditional priests were angry. The religious authorities were angry. The conservatives in Rome were angry. They felt like their world was being torn apart by this teenage foreigner who didn't understand Roman tradition and didn't care to learn. This anger would have serious consequences. But we'll get to that later. First, we need to talk about Elagabalus's personal life, because the religious revolution was just the beginning. The real scandal was about to start. In ancient Rome, there was a religious order called the Vestal Virgins. These were 6 priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta. They were sworn to eternal virginity. They were sacred. They were untouchable. They were among the most respected and revered people in all of Rome. The vow of chastity was absolute. It was sacred. It was backed by law and religious decree. If a Vestal Virgin broke her vow, if she had sexual relations with a man, the punishment was unimaginably severe. She would be buried alive, not executed by sword, not poisoned, buried alive in a vault, left to slowly suffocate underground as a punishment for breaking her sacred vow. This had actually happened before. There are historical records of Vestal Virgins who were discovered to have broken their vows and were subsequently buried alive. It was one of Rome's most severe punishments, reserved for one of Rome's most sacred crimes. So the vow was no joke. The Vestal Virgins understood that if they broke their vow, they would die. Horribly, slowly, underground. This knowledge shaped their entire existence. These were women who had chosen to dedicate themselves entirely to their religious duty, knowing that any deviation would result in their death. Elagabalus decided to marry one of them. Her name was Aquilia Severa. She was one of Rome's 6 most important Vestal Virgins. She was respected. She was honored. She was sacred, and Elagabalus looked at her and decided that she wanted Aquilia Severa to be her wife. Keep in mind, Elagabalus was a priest. She considered herself the earthly manifestation of the sun god. From her perspective, the marriage was spiritually justified. The sun god, represented through Elagabalus, was choosing to unite with a priestess of another religion. It was a merger of spiritual authorities. It was a divine act. But from the perspective of literally everyone else in Rome, it was absolutely unhinged. Elagabalus announced her intention to marry Aquilia Severa publicly, in front of the Senate, in front of the military, in front of the people. She declared that she was going to marry this Vestal Virgin, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Senators demanded that she be removed from power. Priests called for her assassination. The order of Vestal Virgins was devastated. This wasn't just a scandal. This wasn't just inappropriate. This was sacrilege. This was the destruction of one of Rome's most sacred institutions. But Elagabalus had the military, and the military was loyal. So the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite personal bodyguards, the most powerful military force in Rome, marched through the city, enforcing Elagabalus's will. Anyone who spoke out was arrested. Anyone who resisted was removed. And then Elagabalus took it a step further. She declared that Aquilia Severa's vow of chastity was now void. The Vestal Virgin's most sacred promise. The vow that defined her entire life. The vow that she had sworn before the gods. The vow that would result in her death if broken, was simply declared to be no longer binding. Elagabalus had just used her imperial authority to override one of Rome's most sacred religious laws. She had just shown that her power extended beyond politics and into the realm of religious authority. She had just demonstrated that even the most sacred vows could be broken if the emperor ordered it. The wedding happened in Rome. It was public. It was official. The state recognized the marriage. Aquilia Severa was no longer a Vestal Virgin. She was now the wife of the emperor, and everyone in Rome was watching to see what would happen next. Here's where it gets really interesting. We don't actually know if Elagabalus and Aquilia Severa's marriage was romantic in nature or primarily political-religious. We don't know if they actually loved each other, or if this was purely a power move on Elagabalus's part. We don't know what Aquilia Severa actually thought about the whole situation. What we do know is that they lived together. They were publicly recognized as a married couple. And they remained together until Elagabalus's fall from power. But here's the thing. Elagabalus wasn't satisfied with just being married to a woman. She had bigger ideas about how she wanted to reshape her personal life. At some point during her reign, historians aren't entirely sure exactly when, Elagabalus began demanding that people refer to her using feminine pronouns. She wanted to be called lady instead of lord. She wanted to be addressed as she instead of he. In the early 3rd century AD in the Roman Empire, this was absolutely unprecedented. Gender was seen as a fixed, biological, unchangeable fact. A person assigned male at birth would spend their entire life as a man. That's just how it worked. There was no flexibility. There was no option. Gender roles were rigidly enforced and universally accepted. Men were dominant. Men were powerful. Men were leaders. Women were subordinate. Women were followers. Women had limited rights and limited power. And suddenly, Elagabalus, who had been born assigned male, was demanding to be treated as a woman. Moreover, Elagabalus didn't just demand this as a personal preference. She demanded it as an imperial decree. She made it a matter of imperial law. Soldiers were ordered to refer to her using feminine pronouns. Senators were ordered to do the same. Officials were required to do the same. It was enforced by imperial authority. Think about how radical this was, in a society where women had almost no power. Where gender roles were absolute and unchanging, Elagabalus had just used the ultimate power, the power of the state, to challenge those gender roles and demand recognition of a new gender identity. But Elagabalus went even further. She asked her courtiers and close advisors to help her figure out a new name. She had been called various things, Elagabal, Marcus Aurelius, Antoninus Augustus, but she wanted a name that would reflect her feminine identity. Eventually she settled on Elagabal, but with the feminine form. She became Elagabala. Or sometimes she went by variations like Bassiana. And then Elagabalus made a request that completely shocked everyone. She went to her physicians and asked them if it was possible to perform surgery on her body to make her female. Specifically, she asked if they could perform a procedure that would allow her to become pregnant and bear children. The physicians, horrified and baffled, basically said no. This was the 3rd century AD. They didn't have the medical knowledge to perform such a procedure. They didn't have the technology. And they certainly didn't have the conceptual framework for understanding what Elagabalus was asking for. But the request itself is fascinating, because it suggests that Elagabalus wasn't just expressing a gender identity for political purposes. She wasn't just demanding feminine pronouns as a power move. She was actually asking for medical intervention to change her body to match her gender identity. Was Elagabalus experiencing genuine gender dysphoria? Was she genuinely experiencing herself as a woman trapped in a male body? Or was this something else? Religious conviction, psychological breakdown, teenage rebellion? Modern historians genuinely don't know, and that's what makes her so interesting. What we do know is that Elagabalus walked through the palace calling herself Lady instead of Lord. She demanded that people address her by feminine pronouns. She married women. She demanded recognition as a woman. She asked for medical intervention to change her body. Whether this was authentic gender identity or political performance or some combination of the two, it's impossible to say. But it's undeniable that Elagabalus was challenging one of Rome's most fundamental social structures, the rigid gender hierarchy. And she was doing it from the most powerful position imaginable. But the gender stuff wasn't the only shocking thing about Elagabalus's personal life. The thing that really made Rome explode was her relationship with a man named Heracles. Heracles was a chariot driver, possibly the most famous chariot driver in Rome, but his background is unclear. What we know is that Elagabalus became obsessed with him. She fell in love with him. Or possibly she decided to pursue him for political reasons. Or possibly she was just a teenager with absolute power doing whatever she wanted. Again, we don't actually know. What we do know is that Elagabalus didn't just take Heracles as a lover. She didn't just have him brought to the palace for private encounters. She did something far more scandalous. She demanded that Rome recognize her marriage to Heracles as an actual official marriage. She wanted Heracles to be recognized as her husband. She wanted to be referred to as his wife. She wanted the marriage to have legal standing. But here's where it gets complicated. Elagabalus was demanding to be treated as female. So she was essentially saying, I am a woman, and I am marrying a man, and we are having a normal heterosexual marriage. But that's not how Rome saw it. Because from Rome's perspective, Elagabalus had been born male. So from Rome's perspective, what was happening was that a person assigned male was marrying a man. It was what modern people would call a same-sex marriage. It was something that Rome found absolutely disgusting. In ancient Rome, there was flexibility around sexual relationships. Men could have relationships with younger men or boys in certain circumstances, though this was controversial even then. But marriage was different. Marriage was supposed to be between a man and a woman. The entire structure of marriage was based on gender roles and hierarchies. and Elagabalus was trying to marry another man. The Senate was losing its mind. The traditional priests were losing their minds. The military commanders were losing their minds. This was too much. This was beyond the pale. This was absolutely unacceptable, but Elagabalus was the emperor. She had absolute power. She could do whatever she wanted. So she married Heracles anyway. And then she did something even more shocking. She walked through the palace in front of courtiers and guards and senators, and referred to herself as Heracles' wife. She called Heracles her husband. She talked about her marriage to him as if it were a normal, accepted thing. She even asked servants and courtiers to help her with her appearance, to make her look more beautiful for her husband. She took on the role of wife. She took on the role of subservient partner in a marriage. She was acting out what she saw as the feminine role in a heterosexual marriage. The cognitive dissonance for Rome was absolutely extreme. Here was their emperor, the most powerful person in the world, voluntarily taking on a subordinate role, voluntarily acting as a wife, voluntarily putting herself in a position of weakness and dependence. It was seen as pathetic. It was seen as delusional. It was seen as a betrayal of everything the empire stood for. But Elagabalus wasn't satisfied with just Aquilia Severa and Heracles. Over the course of her reign, she married 5 different people, 5 in 4 years. The math works out to roughly 1 new marriage every year. We don't know all the details of all 5 marriages. Historical records are fragmentary. What we do know is that the marriages ended in divorce or dissolution with surprising frequency. Elagabalus would marry someone, live with them for a while, and then, for whatever reason, the marriage would end and she would move on to the next person. It's possible that Elagabalus was genuinely searching for something. She was searching for the right partner. She was searching for genuine love or connection. She was searching for someone who understood her and accepted her gender identity and could give her what she needed. Or it's possible that Elagabalus was just a teenager with absolute power doing whatever she wanted, and the marriages were a way of exercising that power. It's possible that she was just collecting husbands and wives the way some people collect possessions. It's possible that she was deeply, fundamentally unstable and incapable of maintaining any kind of stable relationship. The truth is probably some combination of all of these things. What's remarkable is that Elagabalus kept trying. Even as her relationships failed, even as each divorce became more and more controversial, even as Rome became more and more opposed to her behavior, she kept marrying people. She kept seeking out new partners. She kept trying to build something. It speaks to either genuine desperation, the kind of desperation you might feel if you're fundamentally different from everyone around you and you're desperately searching for someone who understands you, or genuine delusion, or both. While all of this personal chaos was happening, Elagabalus was also doubling down on her religious revolution. The temple to the sun god was being built. Work was proceeding on this enormous religious edifice, and Elagabalus was using her position to reshape Rome's entire spiritual landscape. She promoted the worship of the sun god above all other deities. She required priests to acknowledge the supremacy of the sun god. She restructured religious festivals and ceremonies to emphasize the sun god. She was systematically, deliberately rewriting Rome's religious tradition. Some of this actually made a certain amount of sense from a theological perspective. The sun god was a genuinely important deity in many Mediterranean cultures. The symbolism of the sun as a source of life and energy was powerful. A unified religious system centered on the sun, God could have provided spiritual coherence to an empire that was fragmented and chaotic. But the way Elagabalus was doing it was catastrophic. She wasn't building consensus. She wasn't persuading people through argument and evidence. She was simply using imperial authority to impose changes. She was bulldozing through centuries of tradition. She was dismissing the spiritual and cultural concerns of millions of people. The priests of other gods were angry. Their temples were being subordinated. Their deities were being declared inferior. Their role in Rome's spiritual life was being diminished. They had spent their entire lives serving their gods, and now they were being told that their gods were actually less important than a god from Syria. The people were confused and angry. They didn't understand why their religion was changing. They didn't understand why their emperor was destroying their spiritual traditions. They didn't understand why they were being forced to worship a god they had never heard of before. But Elagabalus was committed to her vision. She was going to transform Rome spiritually, no matter what the cost. Chapter 11. The grandmother's manipulation throughout all of this, the religious reforms, the gender revolution, the multiple marriages. Elagabalus's grandmother Maesa was watching carefully. Maesa was in her 60s now. Her health was declining. She wouldn't live much longer, and she was starting to realize that her granddaughter was becoming a liability. Maesa's original goal had been simple: keep her family in power. She had put Elagabalus on the throne in order to secure her family's position. She had assumed that she could control Elagabalus, could manipulate her, could use her as a puppet through which Maesa could exercise power. But Elagabalus wasn't cooperating with that plan. Elagabalus had her own ideas. Elagabalus was making her own decisions. Elagabalus was pursuing her own agenda, regardless of what Maesa thought was politically prudent. From Maesa's perspective, Elagabalus was destroying everything. The empire was becoming more unstable, not more stable. The scandals were piling up. The opposition was growing. The military was becoming restless. The Senate was becoming bolder in its resistance. Maesa realized that Elagabalus was going to crash and burn, and when she did, she would take the entire family down with her. Maesa's power, Maesa's wealth, Maesa's position, all of it was contingent on maintaining imperial authority. And Elagabalus was squandering that authority through her reckless, scandalous behavior. So Maesa made a decision. She was going to move against her own granddaughter. Maesa had another granddaughter. Her name was Jessia Marcella, though she also went by Severus Alexander. He was young, maybe 12 or 13, but he was male, and he was popular with the traditional factions in Rome. He was seen as more stable, more normal, more aligned with Roman tradition than Elagabalus was. Maesa decided that Severus Alexander was going to replace Elagabalus as emperor. She began spreading rumors. She told people that Elagabalus was unfit to rule, that the scandals had gone too far, that Rome needed someone new, that Severus Alexander was the future, that Severus Alexander represented a return to stability and tradition. It was a brilliant political move. Maesa was essentially offering Rome exactly what they wanted to hear: that the chaos was going to end, that things would go back to normal, that a more traditional leader would take power and restore order. Chapter 12. The conflict emerges when Elagabalus found out what her grandmother was doing. She was furious. Elagabalus understood that Maesa was trying to remove her from power. Elagabalus understood that her own grandmother was orchestrating her downfall, and Elagabalus decided to fight back. She had Severus Alexander arrested. She declared him unfit. She had him imprisoned. She tried to reassert her authority over her grandmother and over the empire. But this is where we see the fundamental problem with Elagabalus's position. She had power, but she didn't have the institutional support to maintain that power. She had the military, or at least she had the military commanders who had originally supported her. But those commanders were aging. New commanders were taking over, and those new commanders were less loyal to Elagabalus than the old ones had been. Elagabalus also didn't have the support of the Senate. The Senate had been resisting her since day one. The Senate was looking for any opportunity to remove her. Elagabalus also didn't have the support of the traditional priests, because she had directly challenged their religious authority. The priests wanted her gone. Elagabalus also didn't have the support of significant portions of the people, because the scandals had turned them against her. They saw her as dangerous. They saw her as a threat to Rome's traditional values. What Elagabalus did have was the support of her grandmother, and her grandmother was now turning against her. Without Maesa's backing, Elagabalus was vulnerable, and she didn't seem to realize it. She was 18 or 19 years old now. She had been emperor for 4 years. She had gotten used to having absolute power. She had gotten used to people obeying her. She had gotten used to being able to do whatever she wanted without facing serious consequences. But that was about to change. Chapter 13. The gathering storm over the following months. The pressure on Elagabalus intensified. Maesa was spreading rumors constantly. She was meeting with military leaders. She was building a coalition. She was laying the groundwork for a coup. The Praetorian Guard, the same military force that had put Elagabalus in power, began to fracture. Some commanders were still loyal to Elagabalus. But others were starting to see Severus Alexander as the better choice. Severus Alexander represented stability. Severus Alexander represented a return to normalcy. Severus Alexander wouldn't push radical religious reforms. Severus Alexander wouldn't marry Vestal Virgins. Severus Alexander wouldn't challenge centuries of tradition. Severus Alexander was safe. Severus Alexander represented everything Rome wanted in an emperor at that moment. Elagabalus tried to fight back. She released Severus Alexander from imprisonment. She tried to use her charm and charisma to win people over. She tried to explain her vision to the Senate. But it was too late. The machinery of her removal was already in motion. Mesa, now in her 70s and clearly dying, accelerated her plan. She met with the Praetorian Guard one final time. She made them an offer. Support Severus Alexander, and Mesa would ensure that the Guard was rewarded generously for their loyalty. They would receive increases in pay. They would receive promotions. They would receive power and prestige. The Guard agreed. The decision was made. Elagabalus would be removed from power. Chapter 14. The fall had happened in the spring of 222 AD. The exact date is unclear. Historical records are vague, but it was around March or April. Elagabalus was in the palace. She was probably going about her daily business. She was probably unaware of just how close her downfall actually was. She was probably confident that she could maintain power. She was probably assuming that her status as emperor would protect her. She was about to learn a harsh lesson about the fragility of power. The Praetorian Guard surrounded the palace. They marched into the imperial chambers. They confronted Elagabalus directly and informed her that her reign was over. There's no record of what Elagabalus said or did at this moment. Did she beg for mercy? Did she try to negotiate? Did she try to appeal to their loyalty? Did she attempt to escape? We don't know. All we know is what happened next. The Guard murdered her. They executed their own emperor. The woman who had absolute authority, who commanded their loyalty, who had the power of life and death over all of them. They killed her. She was approximately 18 years old. Some sources say she might have been as old as 22. Some sources say she might have been as young as 16. Nobody is sure. But she was definitely still a teenager. Definitely still young. Definitely still a person who had barely had time to even understand the complexity of her own position before it was taken from her. But the humiliation didn't end with her death. The Guard's actions after her execution were deliberately cruel, deliberately designed to dishonor her memory and destroy any legacy she might leave behind. They dragged her body through the streets of Rome. They paraded her corpse like a trophy of war. They subjected her body to public ridicule and shame. They were sending a message. This person was evil, this person was wrong. This person deserved to be treated like garbage even in death. And then they threw her body into the Tiber River. This was the ultimate insult. To be thrown into the river meant that there would be no proper burial, no funeral rites, no spiritual closure. In the Roman understanding of the world, this meant that Elagabalus's soul would be tormented forever. She would have no peace in the afterlife. She would have no rest. Her body disappeared into the water. It was probably found later and disposed of permanently. But the point had been made. Elagabalus had been erased. Chapter 15. The erasure immediately after Elagabalus's death. The machinery of historical erasure began to operate. The Senate issued decrees condemning Elagabalus's memory. They called for all records of her reign to be destroyed. They called for all statues of her to be torn down. They called for her name to be struck from official documents. They called for a kind of deliberate forgetting, a systematic attempt to erase her from history. This process is called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It's when a government decides that a person was so evil, so reviled, so beyond the pale that they don't deserve to exist in historical memory. Their name is erased. Their deeds are forgotten. They are struck from the record as if they never existed. Elagabalus suffered this fate more thoroughly than almost anyone else in Roman history. Senators who had supported her were executed or exiled. Her temple was destroyed. Her religious reforms were reversed. Severus Alexander, her replacement, spent his entire reign trying to undo everything she had done. He dismissed the sun god as the primary deity. He returned Rome to its traditional religious system. He moved forward as if Elagabalus had never existed. For centuries, for literally over 1,000 years. The primary source of information about Elagabalus came from hostile historians, who were writing long after her death, using second-hand or third-hand accounts, many of which had probably been distorted or exaggerated. These historians painted Elagabalus as a monster. They emphasized the most shocking and scandalous aspects of her reign. They portrayed her as deranged, as sexually deviant, as a threat to civilization. They used her as a cautionary tale about what happens when you put the wrong person in power. And for a very long time, that's what people believed. That Elagabalus was a monster, that her reign had been a catastrophe, that she deserved to be erased from history. But what if that's not the whole story? Isaiah, chapter 16. The historical reconstruction. In recent decades, scholars, particularly modern historians and gender scholars, have begun to look at Elagabalus's reign with fresh eyes. And what they've discovered is that the traditional historical narrative is probably significantly distorted. Modern historians point out that we have almost no contemporary accounts of Elagabalus's reign. We don't have writings from people who were actually alive during her time, who actually witnessed events as they happened. Everything we know about Elagabalus comes from historians writing a century or more later, using sources that were themselves written by people hostile to Elagabalus. This is a massive problem for historical accuracy. It's like trying to understand someone's life by reading a hostile biography written by their enemy, 100 years after they died, written using sources from other people who were also enemies of that person. The distortion is inevitable. Modern scholars have tried to separate the facts from the distortions, and what they've found is interesting. First, some of the sexual scandals attributed to Elagabalus were probably exaggerated or invented. Some of them might have been completely fabricated. Ancient historians had a tendency to embellish shocking stories, especially when the person involved was someone they disliked. Second, Elagabalus's religious reforms were probably more coherent and theologically defensible than traditional accounts suggest. The idea of organizing an empire around a unified sun god worship wasn't actually crazy. Many empires and religions have done similar things. Elagabalus' methods were reckless and her execution was poor. But the underlying idea wasn't necessarily wrong. Third, and this is the most important part, Elagabalus's gender identity and her demand to be treated as a woman were probably not just political performance or psychological delusion. Modern scholars believe that Elagabalus probably was experiencing genuine gender dysphoria. She probably did genuinely understand herself as a woman. She probably was genuinely trying to live authentically in a world that gave her absolutely no framework for doing so. Think about what that would mean. Imagine being a teenager in the 3rd century AD, understanding yourself as a woman, knowing that society would never accept that, knowing that there were no words in your language to describe what you were experiencing, knowing that everyone around you would consider you insane or evil, and then imagine gaining absolute power. Imagine being in a position where you could actually force the world to acknowledge your identity, force people to recognize you as you understand yourself, force people to use the pronouns you wanted them to use. From that perspective, Elagabalus's behavior starts to look less like derangement and more like desperation, less like selfishness and more like a fundamental human need to be recognized and accepted for who you actually are. Chapter 17. The Marriage Mystery. One of the most fascinating aspects of Elagabalus' story is the question of her marriage to Aquilia Severa. Historians have spent centuries debating what the nature of this relationship actually was. Was it genuinely romantic? Did Elagabalus actually love Aquilia Severa? Did Aquilia Severa love her back? Or was this purely a political and religious maneuver on Elagabalus's part, a way of asserting her power and challenging Roman tradition? The truth is that we don't know. We have almost no information about Aquilia Severa's perspective or feelings. We don't know if she consented to the marriage willingly or if she was coerced. We don't know if she was a willing participant in Elagabalus's revolution or a victim of it. What we do know is that they lived together, and that they maintained their marriage until Elagabalus's fall from power. That suggests at least some kind of functional relationship. But was it love? Was it genuine intimacy? Was it consensual? These are questions we might never be able to answer with certainty. But they're important questions, because they get at something fundamental about Elagabalus's character and her motivations. If the marriage was genuinely romantic, if Elagabalus was actually in love with Aquilia Severa, Then her desire to marry a Vestal Virgin becomes less of a political power move and more of a genuine human need to connect with another person. It becomes an act of romantic love, not just religious rebellion. On the other hand, if the marriage was purely political, if Elagabalus was just using Aquilia Severa as a tool to demonstrate her power and challenge Roman tradition, then it takes on a darker character. It becomes an act of manipulation and exploitation. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Elagabalus was probably simultaneously experiencing genuine romantic or emotional attraction, while also deliberately making a political statement. She was probably both authentically seeking connection and deliberately provoking Rome's traditional order. These things aren't mutually exclusive. Chapter 18. The question of authenticity. Here's what I think is really important to understand about Elagabalus, and I want you to think carefully about this. The distinction between authentic and performative might not actually be meaningful when we're talking about someone in Elagabalus's position. Modern people are obsessed with the idea of authenticity. We want to know the real person underneath the public performance. We want to separate the genuine self from the role that's being played. We believe that there's an authentic inner self that's distinct from the public persona. But Elagabalus lived in a world where power and identity were completely intertwined. Everything she did was simultaneously personal and political. There was no separation between her private identity and her public performance because she was the emperor. Her personal identity was the public identity. They were the same thing. When Elagabalus demanded to be called a woman, was she expressing an authentic gender identity, or was she performing her power? The answer is both. She was simultaneously expressing what she genuinely believed about herself and demonstrating that she had the power to force the entire empire to recognize her identity. When Elagabalus married Aquilia Severa, was it a genuine romantic choice or a political maneuver? Both. She was simultaneously seeking genuine human connection and making a deliberate statement about the fragility of Roman tradition and the power she possessed to overturn it. The idea that you can separate these things into authentic and performative is probably a modern misconception. Elagabalus was authentic and performative simultaneously. She was genuine and political at the same time. And these two aspects of her behavior were inseparable. Chapter 19. The support system. One thing that's often overlooked in discussions of Elagabalus is that she actually did have supporters. Not just people forced to support her by military power, but people who genuinely believed in her vision and wanted to help her implement it. There were priests who were excited about the religious reforms. There were senators who were fascinated by her vision of a reorganized religious system. There were intellectuals and philosophers who found her ideas interesting. There were common people who were intrigued by her challenge to tradition. If history had gone differently, if her grandmother had continued to support her, if the military had remained loyal, if she'd had another decade to consolidate power and build broader support, she might have actually succeeded in transforming Rome. Think about that. Imagine a world where Elagabalus wasn't overthrown. Imagine a world where her religious reforms took root and actually became the foundation of Roman religion. Imagine a world where Elagabalus's understanding of gender became normalized throughout the empire. Imagine a world where emperors could openly express gender identities different from their assigned sex. Rome would be completely different. Civilization would have taken a very different path, and Elagabalus would be remembered not as a scandalous monster but as a visionary reformer. She would be remembered as the emperor who reshaped Rome spiritually and socially. She would be remembered as a hero who challenged oppressive traditions and opened up new possibilities for human identity and expression. But she didn't win. She was defeated, and because she was defeated, she was remembered by her enemies. Her memory was shaped by people who hated her, opposed her, and wanted to make sure that no one would ever try to do what she did again. Power is fragile. History is fragile. The victors get to define what gets remembered and how it gets remembered. Chapter 20. Severus Alexander's reign. After Elagabalus was murdered and thrown into the Tiber River, Severus Alexander took power as emperor. He was around 13 years old when he became emperor. And unlike Elagabalus, he was exactly what Rome wanted. He was male. He was traditionally minded. He respected Roman tradition. He wasn't going to push radical religious reforms. He wasn't going to challenge gender norms. He wasn't going to upset the established order. He spent his entire reign trying to undo everything Elagabalus had done. He systematically reversed her religious reforms. He brought back the traditional gods. He demolished the temple to the sun god that Elagabalus had started building. He tried to erase every trace of her attempted religious revolution. He was popular. The Senate liked him. The military liked him. The people liked him. Rome settled back into its comfortable traditional order. Everything returned to normal. But here's the thing. While Severus Alexander was a safe choice, he was also boring. He didn't inspire passionate loyalty. He didn't inspire passionate hatred. He didn't matter. He was a placeholder. He was what Rome wanted, but he wasn't significant. He wasn't going to change history. He wasn't going to be remembered as someone who did anything particularly important. Elagabalus, on the other hand, was significant. Even in her defeat, even after her assassination, even after her name was struck from official records, Elagabalus was significant. She was important. She was remembered. And she was remembered precisely because she had broken the rules and challenged the status quo. History remembers the rule breakers more than it remembers the safe choices. Chapter 21, The Cost of Defiance here, as what I think is the real lesson of Elagabalus's story. Defying the status quo has a cost. If you're going to challenge the established order, if you're going to break the rules, if you're going to demand that the world recognize you as you understand yourself, you need to understand that there will be people fighting back. There will be people invested in the old ways. There will be people who benefit from the existing system. There will be people who are terrified by what you're trying to do, and they will fight you, hard, with everything they have. Elagabalus didn't have the patience to navigate that conflict. She didn't have the political skill to build a broad coalition of support. She didn't have the ability to persuade people that her vision was worth supporting. She just tried to impose her will through force and authority. And it didn't work. Because force and authority alone aren't enough to sustain power over the long term. You need broader support. You need people to believe that you're right. You need institutions and systems that can persist beyond your personal power. Elagabalus failed because she tried to do too much, too fast, without enough support, and she paid the ultimate price. But here's the thing. Her failure doesn't mean she was wrong. It doesn't mean her vision was fundamentally flawed. It just means she didn't have the skill or the patience or the luck to make it work. Some of the most important people in history have failed. They've been defeated. They've been erased. But they're still important because they tried. They showed that the status quo was changeable. They showed that the rules could be broken. They showed that things didn't have to be the way they were. Chapter 22. The Modern Perspective. Here's where it gets really interesting. In modern times, scholars have begun to re-examine Elagabalus's reign from new perspectives. Gender scholars in particular have found her story fascinating. Some scholars argue that Elagabalus was one of the earliest documented cases of someone experiencing and expressing gender dysphoria. They point to her demand to be called a woman, her request for surgical intervention, her clothing choices, her adoption of feminine mannerisms, her demand to be treated as a wife in her marriages. All of these things, taken together, suggest a person who understood herself as a woman, who was desperately trying to live according to that understanding, and who was using every tool available to her to force the world to recognize that identity. From this perspective, Elagabalus becomes a tragic figure. She was a person born too early, in a society that had absolutely no framework for understanding gender identity as separate from biological sex. She was trapped in a world that couldn't accept who she was. She was a person who tried to live authentically in a world that wouldn't let her. Other scholars are more skeptical. They argue that we shouldn't impose modern concepts of gender identity onto a person from the 3rd century AD. They argue that Elagabalus was probably motivated by religious ideology rather than gender dysphoria. They argue that conflating ancient religious practices with modern gender identity is anachronistic and inappropriate. But what's interesting is that this debate is happening at all. We're still arguing about who Elagabalus really was 2,000 years later. We're still trying to figure out her motivations, her beliefs, her genuine identity beneath all the scandal and exaggeration. And that's significant. That means Elagabalus still matters. That means her story still has relevance. That means she's not really erased, even though Rome tried so hard to erase her. Chapter 23. The Historical Sources. To understand how distorted our image of Elagabalus actually is, we need to talk about the historical sources we have about her. The primary sources for Elagabalus' reign come from a few ancient historians, most notably Cassius Dio and later writers who drew on Cassius Dio's account. The problem is that Cassius Dio was writing about a century after Elagabalus' death. He never actually witnessed any of the events he was describing. He was relying on second-hand or third-hand accounts from people who were biased against Elagabalus. Moreover, there's strong evidence that Cassius Dio was deliberately embellishing certain stories for dramatic effect. Ancient historians didn't always prioritize accuracy the way modern historians do. They were often more interested in telling a compelling story. If a story was shocking and scandalous and made a good narrative, historians would include it even if they weren't entirely sure it was true. So when Cassius Dio describes Elagabalus' sexual behavior or her requests for medical intervention or her marriages, we need to take those descriptions with a grain of salt. Some of them are probably true. Some of them are probably exaggerated. Some of them might be completely fabricated. The problem is that we don't actually know which is which. We don't have independent verification for most of the claims made about Elagabalus. We don't have official imperial records from her reign that we can compare against the historical accounts. We don't have the accounts of people who supported her, who loved her, who wanted to preserve her memory. We only have the accounts of people who opposed her and wanted to make sure she would be remembered as a monster. It's like trying to understand someone's entire life by reading a hostile biography written by your worst enemy. The distortion is inevitable. Chapter 24. What we actually know. So what do we actually know about Elagabalus with reasonable certainty? Let's separate what we can verify from what we're less sure about. We know that Elagabalus existed. She was a real person who really did become Emperor of Rome. We know that she was put in power by her grandmother Mesa and the military, probably through a combination of propaganda and military force. We know that she initiated religious reforms that challenged Rome's traditional religious system. We know that she married at least one Vestal Virgin, Aquilia Severa, which was unprecedented and scandalous. We know that she demanded to be addressed using feminine pronouns and identified as a woman. We know that she had multiple marriages over a short period of time. We know that she was eventually removed from power by the Praetorian Guard. We know that she was murdered and her body was disposed of in the Tiber River. We know that her memory was systematically erased by the next emperor and the Senate. Beyond these basic facts, much of what we know about Elagabalus is uncertain. The specific details are disputed. The motivations are unclear. The authentic versus performed aspects of her behavior are impossible to distinguish with certainty. What we're left with is a fragmentary historical record and a lot of room for interpretation. Chapter 25. The question of gender. Let's focus on one specific question, because it's the one that modern people find most interesting. Was Elagabalus transgender in the modern sense? The answer is we don't know, and we can't know with certainty, because we don't have access to Elagabalus's internal thoughts or feelings. We don't know how she understood herself. We don't know if what she was experiencing in the 3rd century AD was the same thing that modern transgender people experience. But here's what we do know. Elagabalus demanded to be called a woman. Elagabalus took on the social role of a wife in her marriages. Elagabalus asked physicians if they could surgically modify her body. Elagabalus expressed discomfort with being treated as male. These are all behaviors that modern people would associate with gender dysphoria or transgender identity. So by modern standards, Elagabalus would probably be classified as transgender. But is that an appropriate classification? Is it appropriate to use modern concepts like transgender to describe someone from the 3rd century AD? This is where historians and scholars disagree. Some scholars say yes. They say that gender dysphoria is a consistent human experience across time and cultures. They say that Elagabalus was probably experiencing what we would now recognize as transgender identity. They say that using modern terminology to describe ancient people is a legitimate way of making their experience comprehensible to modern audiences. Other scholars say no, They say that gender in the ancient world was understood differently than it is in the modern world. They say that we shouldn't impose modern categories onto ancient people. They say that doing so distorts our understanding of both ancient and modern gender. My take on this is that both perspectives have merit. It's probably true that Elagabalus was experiencing something that we would recognize as gender dysphoria or transgender identity, but it's also true that the social context was completely different from the modern world, and that probably shaped how she experienced her gender identity. What's important is that Elagabalus was a person who understood herself as different from how society categorized her. She was a person who demanded recognition of that difference. She was a person who used every tool available to her to live according to her understanding of herself. That's significant, regardless of exactly what terminology we use to describe it. Chapter 26. The Power Dynamic. Another fascinating aspect of Elagabalus's story is the reversal of power dynamics in her relationships. Elagabalus was the most powerful person in Rome. She had absolute authority. She could order anyone to do anything. She could have anyone executed. She could have anyone imprisoned. She had unlimited power. But in her personal relationships, especially her relationships with men like Hierocles, she voluntarily took a subordinate position. She called herself a wife. She acted as if her partners were superior to her. She treated her romantic partners as if they had authority over her. This is fascinating from a psychological perspective. Here was a person with unlimited power, choosing to relinquish that power in her personal relationships, choosing to put herself in a position of vulnerability and subordination. Why? What would cause someone to do that? One possibility is that Elagabalus was seeking genuine intimacy. She was seeking a connection with another person that wasn't based on power dynamics. She was seeking someone who would accept her not as an emperor but as a person, someone who would relate to her as an equal or as someone she was subordinate to, not as someone who was subordinate to her. From this perspective, Elagabalus's behavior in her personal relationships was an attempt to escape the isolation of power. She was trying to find genuine human connection in a world where everyone was afraid of her. Another possibility is that Elagabalus was expressing something about her gender identity through these relationships. By taking a subordinate role in heterosexual relationships, she was expressing what she understood as a female gender role. She was demonstrating through her actions that she understood herself as a woman in a way that went beyond just demanding feminine pronouns. Of course, there's also the possibility that Elagabalus was just a confused teenager with too much power, making impulsive decisions based on emotional attachment rather than rational thought. The truth is probably some combination of all of these things. Chapter 27. The Legacy. So what's the ultimate legacy of Elagabalus? What does her 4-year reign tell us about power, tradition, identity, and the cost of defiance? First, power without broad institutional support is temporary. Elagabalus had the military, but she didn't have the Senate. She didn't have the priests. She didn't have the people. And when her primary personal supporter, her grandmother, turned against her, she became vulnerable. She had absolute power, but she didn't have sustainable power. Second, tradition is incredibly powerful because it offers comfort and familiarity. People prefer the known to the unknown, even if the known is unjust or limiting. When Elagabalus tried to overturn centuries of tradition, people fought back because they wanted their familiar world back, even if that familiar world was oppressive. Third, the people who lose get their story told by their enemies. Elagabalus lost, and because she lost, we know her only through the eyes of people who hated her. If she had won, she might be remembered as one of Rome's greatest reformers and visionaries. But she lost, and so she's remembered as a cautionary tale. Fourth, the most interesting and significant people in history are often those who broke the rules and challenged the status quo. We don't remember Severus Alexander as well as we remember Elagabalus, even though Severus Alexander was successful and popular. We remember Elagabalus because she was shocking, scandalous, and rule-breaking. Fifth, defying the status quo has a cost. Elagabalus paid that cost with her life. If you're going to challenge the established order, you need to understand that there will be opposition. There will be people fighting to maintain the old system. And if you don't have the power or the skill or the political connections to outlast them, you will lose. But here's the most important lesson of all. Elagabalus mattered. Even in her defeat, Even after her assassination, even after her name was struck from the records, even after 2,000 years of historical erasure, elagabalus still matters. We're still talking about her. We're still debating who she was. We're still trying to figure out if she was a monster or a victim or a visionary. We're still trying to understand her motivations and her identity. That's legacy. That's significance. That's the mark you leave on history if you're willing to break the rules and challenge the status quo, even if you ultimately fail. Chapter 28. The comparison to modern times. And here's where things get really interesting. Because elagabalus's story is actually deeply relevant to modern times. We have our own people who are challenging the status quo. We have our own people who are demanding that the world recognize their identities. We have our own people who are pushing back against traditions and asking for things that make the establishment uncomfortable. Some of those people are heroes. Some of them are making the world better by challenging oppressive norms. Some of them are genuine visionaries who deserve our support. Some of them are just rebels without a cause, pushing back on traditions that are actually worth preserving. Some of them are causing harm rather than good. The difference between the two? It's hard to tell when you're living through it. We usually don't know until decades or centuries later. And by then, either the rebels have already won and reshaped society in their image, or they've been defeated and their memory has been systematically erased. But what's important to understand is that elagabalus's fundamental demand was reasonable. She wanted to be recognized as she understood herself. She wanted the world to acknowledge her identity. She wanted to be treated with dignity and respect. That's not an unreasonable demand. That's a deeply human demand. And the fact that Rome couldn't accommodate that demand, the fact that acknowledging elagabalus's identity would have been seen as destabilizing the entire society, says something about how rigid and fragile Rome's social order actually was. A truly strong society would be able to accommodate people who are different. A truly strong society would be able to accept people who challenge tradition. A truly strong society wouldn't need to erase people from history. Rome felt threatened by elagabalus. Rome felt like she represented such a fundamental challenge to the established order that she had to be destroyed. And that tells us something important about Rome's confidence in its own traditions. Chapter 29. The untold story here is something that historians often don't emphasize. We don't actually know what elagabalus wanted. We don't know her hopes and dreams. We don't know her fears and anxieties. We don't know what motivated her beyond what we can infer from her actions, because all of her personal writings have been lost. All of her journals, if she kept any, are gone. All of her correspondence has been destroyed. All of the direct evidence of her inner life has been systematically erased. What we have are the accounts of hostile historians, telling us what elagabalus did, but not why she did it. We have fragments. We have pieces. But we don't have the full picture. Imagine if all of your personal writings were destroyed. Imagine if everything people knew about you came from the accounts of your enemies. Imagine if historians were writing about you 100 years after your death, using second-hand sources from people who hated you. That's the situation elagabalus is in. That's why her true story is probably lost to history. That's why we can only speculate about who she really was. Maybe she was genuinely experiencing gender dysphoria and desperately trying to live authentically. Maybe she was primarily motivated by religious ideology and believed she was genuinely divine. Maybe she was a confused teenager who used her power to act out her psychological turmoil. Maybe she was a visionary who was ahead of her time. Maybe she was some combination of all of these things we don't know, and we might never know. Chapter 30. The Final Analysis. Here's what I think is the ultimate takeaway from the story of elagabalus. Elagabalus was a real person who lived almost 2,000 years ago. She was a teenager who somehow became the most powerful person in the world. She challenged traditions that had stood for centuries. She demanded recognition of an identity that nobody else in her society could even comprehend. She asked for medical intervention to change her body. She married people in ways that scandalized Rome. She pursued a religious vision that she genuinely believed in. And she lost. She was defeated. She was murdered. Her memory was erased, but she wasn't erased completely. We're still talking about her. We're still debating who she was. We're still trying to understand her motivations. We're still trying to figure out if she was right or wrong, if she was a hero or a villain, if she was a visionary or a confused teenager. That's because elagabalus did something that most people don't do. She broke the rules. She challenged the status quo. She demanded that the world change to accommodate her identity. And even though she ultimately failed, even though she paid for her defiance with her life, her attempt to live authentically and to challenge oppressive traditions still resonates 2,000 years later. That's the real story of Elagabalus, not the scandal, not the marriages, not the religious reforms, but the fundamental human need to be recognized and accepted for who you actually are, and the willingness to challenge an entire society, to risk everything, in order to achieve that recognition. That's what makes her significant. That's what makes her matter. That's what ensures that even 2,000 years after her death, we're still telling her story. Chapter 31. Questions for you. Now I want to turn this over to you. Because history isn't just about what happened in the past. History is about how we interpret those events and what we learn from them. So I need you to comment on this video and answer some questions for me. First, who do you think Elagabalus really was? Was she a victim of historical erasure? A genuine reformer? A reckless teenager with too much power? An early trans icon? A religious revolutionary? A psychological case study? A combination of multiple things? Second, do you think Elagabalus was right or wrong to challenge Rome's traditions? Was she ahead of her time? Or was she pushing changes that Rome wasn't ready for? Third, if you had been a senator in Rome at that time, would you have supported Elagabalus or opposed her? Would you have seen her as a threat or as an interesting new perspective? Fourth, what do you think Elagabalus would have achieved if she had been given more time? If she had lived longer? If her grandmother had continued to support her? If the military had remained loyal? Would she have actually transformed Rome? Or would she have eventually collapsed anyway? Fifth, where are you watching this right now? Are you at home? At work? On a break? On your lunch? In your car? Seriously, I want to know. Drop a comment and tell me where you are. Because I genuinely want to connect with you, the person watching this. And sixth, if you found this story fascinating, if you found Elagabalus's story compelling, if you want to hear more about the most outrageous, scandalous, unbelievable figures from history, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button, because we dive deep into the stories that history textbooks don't want to talk about. We explore the most fascinating, complex, contradictory figures from the past, because history isn't just about dates and battles and famous names. It's about real people making impossible choices in impossible situations. It's about power and desire and the desperate human need to be understood and accepted for who we actually are. Elagabalus understood that need. And even though she lost, even though she was erased, even though we're still not entirely sure if half the stories about her are true, she still matters. She still changes how we think about power, identity, and the cost of defying tradition. Chapter 32. The bigger picture. But before we finish, I want to zoom out and talk about something bigger than just Elagabalus's individual story. I want to talk about what Elagabalus's story tells us about power, society, and how change actually happens in human civilization. One of the most important things to understand is that Elagabalus didn't come out of nowhere. She wasn't an anomaly. She wasn't a random aberration in an otherwise stable society. Rome in the early 3rd century was in crisis. The empire was fragmenting. The economy was collapsing. The military was fracturing. The traditional order was breaking down. This was a moment of transition and chaos and uncertainty. And into this chaos stepped Elagabalus with a vision of radical change. She had a new religious system. She had new ideas about power and authority. She had new ways of understanding identity and gender. From one perspective, Elagabalus was trying to stabilize the empire by giving it a coherent religious center. From another perspective, she was adding to the chaos by overthrowing centuries of tradition. What's interesting is that this pattern keeps repeating throughout history. During moments of social instability and crisis, visionary or revolutionary figures emerge and try to reshape society according to their vision. Some of them succeed, most of them fail. But they all leave their mark on history. Elagabalus failed, but her attempt to reshape Rome tells us something important about that historical moment. It tells us that the empire was fragile. It tells us that tradition was being questioned. It tells us that people were willing to consider radical alternatives to the established order. Chapter 33. The gender question expanded. Let me spend a bit more time on the gender question, because I think it's the most fascinating and most relevant aspect of Elagabalus's story for modern audiences. Throughout history, there have been people who didn't fit into the gender categories that their society imposed on them. Some of them were able to live relatively normal lives by adopting alternative gender expressions that their society could somewhat tolerate. Some of them became spiritual leaders or shamans or priests, roles that allowed them to exist outside of normal gender hierarchies. But some of them, like elagabalus, reached positions of extreme power and tried to openly challenge the gender system itself. What's remarkable about elagabalus is that she didn't just express gender nonconformity quietly. She didn't just live according to her gender identity in private. She declared it publicly. She demanded official recognition. She used the power of the state to enforce that recognition. This is important because it shows that gender nonconformity didn't just suddenly appear in the modern era. It's not a recent invention. It's a constant feature of human society. In every era, in every culture, there have been people who experienced themselves as not fitting into the gender categories they were assigned. The difference between ancient societies and modern societies is that modern societies have some vocabulary and frameworks for understanding and discussing gender nonconformity. We have words like transgender and non-binary and gender dysphoria. These words allow us to talk about something that people in ancient societies definitely experienced but didn't have language to describe. Elagabalus couldn't say, "I'm transgender." She didn't have that word. She didn't have that framework. But she was still experiencing something that we would now recognize as gender dysphoria or transgender identity. And she was trying, with the only tools available to her, to live authentically according to her understanding of herself. She was trying to force the empire to recognize and accommodate her identity. She was trying to prove that gender could be flexible, that it wasn't as fixed and unchangeable as everyone assumed. She failed, but her attempt is still significant. It shows that the desire to live authentically according to one's gender identity is not a modern invention. It's a timeless human desire. Chapter 34. The religious aspecti want to return to the religious dimension of Elagabalus's reign, because I think modern people sometimes underestimate how important the religious aspect was to Elagabalus' motivations. Elagabalus was a priestess. She came from a family of priests. She was raised in a religious context. For her, religion wasn't just a cultural practice or a set of traditions to be respected. Religion was her identity. Religion was how she understood herself and her place in the world. When Elagabalus became emperor, her primary goal wasn't to express her gender identity or to challenge Roman traditions, just for the sake of challenge. Her primary goal was to establish her family's god, the sun god Elagabal, as the supreme deity of the Roman Empire. From her perspective, this was a perfectly reasonable religious reformation. The sun god was genuinely important in Mediterranean cultures. The symbolism of the sun as a source of life and divine power was theologically compelling. Organizing the empire around a unified sun god worship could have actually provided spiritual coherence and purpose. The problem was the execution. Elagabalus tried to impose this religious transformation too quickly and too forcefully. She didn't build consensus. She didn't work with the existing priesthoods. She didn't try to integrate the new religious system with the old traditions in a way that people could accept. If Elagabalus had been more diplomatic, more patient, more politically skilled, she might have actually been able to implement a religious reformation that the empire could accept. But she wasn't. She was a teenager with absolute power, and she wanted her vision implemented immediately. This tells us something important about how religious and social change actually happens. Real, lasting change usually happens gradually, through persuasion and consensus building, not through top-down imposition of authority. Elagabalus tried to do it the second way, and it didn't work. Chapter 35. The military's role. We need to talk more about the military's role in Elagabalus's rise and fall, because the military is actually the key to understanding what happened. In Rome, the military was the ultimate source of power. The person who controlled the military controlled the empire. The person who had the military's loyalty could do almost anything they wanted. But the moment the military withdrew their support, you were finished. Elagabalus had the military's support initially, because her grandmother had basically bought their loyalty through a combination of promises and propaganda. But military loyalty is contingent. It depends on whether you're actually benefiting the people who are loyal to you. As Elagabalus' reign progressed, her behavior became increasingly scandalous and destabilizing. Military commanders started to wonder, is supporting this person actually beneficial to us? Are we getting paid? Are we getting promoted? Are we getting what we were promised? Meanwhile, her grandmother and other members of the elite were suggesting that supporting Severus Alexander would actually be better for the military, that Severus Alexander would be stable, that Severus Alexander would provide consistent leadership, that Severus Alexander would actually be easier to work with. So when the moment came to make a choice, the military chose Severus Alexander, not because Elagabalus had done anything specifically wrong to them, but because her grandmother was offering them a better deal with Severus Alexander. This is a crucial lesson about power. Power based purely on force or authority is vulnerable. You need to actively cultivate loyalty. You need to reward people who support you. You need to make sure that supporting you is actually beneficial to them. Elagabalus failed to do this. She assumed that her position as emperor would be enough to secure loyalty. It wasn't. Chapter 36. The Aquilia. Severa connection. I want to revisit the marriage to Aquilia Severa one more time, because there's something really important here that I don't think gets enough attention. Aquilia Severa was a Vestal Virgin. She had taken a sacred vow of chastity. She had committed her entire life to her religious duty. And Elagabalus essentially forced her into a marriage that violated everything she had devoted herself to. From a modern perspective, this looks like a massive violation. This looks like Elagabalus using her power to coerce Aquilia Severa into something she didn't want. But what if that's not what was happening? What if Aquilia Severa actually wanted to be married to Elagabalus? What if Aquilia Severa was relieved to be released from her vow of chastity? What if Aquilia Severa actually cared for Elagabalus and was willing to give up her role as a Vestal Virgin for the relationship? We don't know. We don't have Aquilia Severa's perspective. We don't have her account of what happened or how she felt about it. We only have the accounts of people who thought the marriage was scandalous and wrong. But this is important to acknowledge. Aquilia Severa was a person. She had agency. She had feelings. She had her own reasons for her choices. We can't assume that she was purely a victim of Elagabalus's abuse of power. She might have been a willing participant in something that she found meaningful. This is another area where historical erasure has affected how we understand the past, because Aquilia Severa's side of the story was never preserved. We only know what people who opposed her choices had to say about her. Chapter 37. The ripple effects. One thing that's interesting about Elagabalus's reign is how it affected the subsequent development of the Roman Empire. After Elagabalus was removed from power, Severus Alexander tried to put things back to normal. He tried to reverse all of her reforms. He tried to restore traditional authority structures. But the fact that Elagabalus had existed, that she had challenged Rome's tradition so radically, that she had pushed boundaries that nobody thought could be pushed, this had an impact on Rome's subsequent history. It showed that the traditional order wasn't as fixed and unchangeable as people assumed. It showed that an emperor could do things that violated centuries of tradition and actually get away with it, at least for a while. It showed that change was possible, even if that particular change was ultimately reversed. Moreover, Elagabalus's attempt to establish a sun god theology might have had long-term effects on the development of Christianity and Roman religion. Some scholars have speculated that Elagabalus's religious reforms had some influence on later theological developments, though this is debated. What's important is to recognize that even failed attempts at change leave their mark on history. Even people who are ultimately defeated have an impact on the future trajectory of their civilization. Chapter 38. The Comparison. To other revolutionary figures, it's interesting to compare Elagabalus to other revolutionary or transformational figures in history, because there are some striking parallels. Elagabalus was a person with a vision for radical change. She had the power to implement that vision, but she didn't have the political skill or the patience to navigate the opposition she faced. She tried to implement too much change too quickly. She didn't build a broad enough coalition of support. She didn't account for how invested people were in the existing system. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Revolutionary figures often fail because they underestimate the strength of the established order. They overestimate how much power they actually have. They try to move too fast. The ones who succeed are usually the ones who understand that real change takes time, that you need to build support gradually, that you need to be willing to compromise and negotiate with the existing power structures, at least to some degree. Elagabalus could have potentially succeeded if she had been more politically sophisticated, if she had moved more gradually, if she had built alliances with important senators and military commanders, if she had framed her reforms in language that was more palatable to Rome's conservative elements. But she didn't. She was a teenager with absolute power, and she wanted change now, and that's why she failed. Chapter 39. The Historical Lessons. So what are the lessons we can draw from Elagabalus's story? What can we learn from her rise and fall? First, power is fragile. Even absolute power can be taken away if you lose the support of the key institutions and people who maintain that power. Elagabalus forgot this. She assumed that her position was unassailable. It wasn't. Second, tradition is powerful because it offers stability and comfort. People resist change because change is scary and uncertainty is frightening. If you're going to challenge tradition, you need to understand that you'll face resistance, and you need to have a plan for dealing with that resistance. Third, building. Genuine support is more important than having formal authority. Elagabalus had formal authority, but she didn't have genuine support from most of Rome's power structures. That made her vulnerable. Fourth, the people who lose their power struggle often get to define the historical narrative. This is why it's so important for us to actively question historical narratives and try to understand the perspective of people who lost their power struggle, because the official history often distorts their legacy in ways that serve the interests of the victors. Fifth, the desire to live authentically, to be recognized for who you actually are, is a fundamental human need. Elagabalus was willing to risk everything and ultimately did lose everything in order to achieve that recognition. That tells us something important about how powerful that need is. Chapter 40. The Modern Resonance. Here's why Elagabalus' story is so relevant to modern times. In many modern societies, people are challenging established traditions around gender, sexuality, family structure, religion, and more. They're demanding recognition of identities that society hasn't traditionally acknowledged. They're pushing for changes to social structures that have existed for centuries. And just like in Elagabalus's time, there are powerful people invested in maintaining the existing system. There are people who feel threatened by these challenges to tradition. There are people who believe that accepting these changes would destabilize society. Some of these challenges will ultimately succeed. Some of them will be integrated into society. Some of them will reshape how we understand identity and community. Some of them will fail. Some of them will be reversed. Some of them will lead to significant backlash. But what matters is that people keep trying. What matters is that people keep demanding recognition and acceptance. What matters is that people keep challenging systems that they believe are unjust or limiting. Elagabalus failed. But people 2,000 years later are still fighting for many of the same things she was fighting for. The right to be recognized, as they understand themselves, the right to challenge traditions that feel oppressive, the right to live authentically. Her failure doesn't invalidate that struggle. It just shows how long this struggle has been going on, and how fundamental it is to the human experience. Chapter 41. The Untold Narratives. Here's something that I think is really important to emphasize. The narrative we have of Elagabalus is an incomplete narrative. It's a narrative told by her enemies. It's a narrative shaped by the people who won. But there's another narrative, the narrative of Elagabalus herself, the narrative of the people who supported her, the narrative of the people who believed in her vision, that has been lost to history. What if we could read Elagabalus's own account of her reign? What if we could hear her explain her motivations, her beliefs, her vision for Rome? What if we could understand her perspective from her own words, rather than from the hostile accounts of her enemies? We can't. That opportunity is lost. But the fact that it's lost should make us humble about the historical narratives we accept as true. When we read history, we're reading the accounts of people who were in a position to preserve their accounts. We're reading the accounts of the victors, the powerful, the people who had the resources to ensure their stories would be remembered, the accounts of people who lost, who were defeated, who didn't have the power to preserve their narratives. Those are often lost or distorted. This is true for Elagabalus. It's true for countless other historical figures. And it should make us skeptical of the neat, clean historical narratives we often encounter. History is messier than the textbooks suggest. History is full of lost voices and untold stories and perspectives that have been erased. Chapter 42. Final Reflections. So here's what I want to leave you with as we wrap up this story. Elagabalus was a real person who lived almost 2,000 years ago. She was a teenager who became the most powerful person in the world. She challenged traditions. She demanded recognition of an identity that society couldn't accommodate. She fought against the establishment. And she lost. Her story is tragic because it ended in her assassination and the erasure of her memory. But it's also inspiring because it shows what's possible when someone has the courage to defy the status quo, even knowing that the odds are stacked against them. Elagabalus didn't win, but she didn't completely lose either. Because even though her memory was erased, even though her reforms were reversed, even though her enemies tried to make sure she would never be remembered, we're still talking about her. We're still debating her legacy. We're still trying to understand who she really was. That's a kind of victory. That's a kind of immortality. That's how you become truly significant in history. Not by being successful, but by being so challenging, so revolutionary, so boundary-pushing that people can't stop talking about you. Even 2,000 years later, Elagabalus achieved that, and that's why her story still matters today. Final call to action, okay? Now I really need you to engage with this. I need you to tell me what you think. Was Elagabalus a victim or a villain? Was she a hero or a cautionary tale? Was she transgender or was she something else entirely? Do you think she was right to challenge Rome's traditions? Do you think she could have succeeded if she had approached things differently? Most importantly, tell me where you're watching this. Are you at work? At home? In your car? On a break? Seriously, I want to know. Drop a comment and tell me where you are right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is all about exploring the most fascinating, controversial, boundary-pushing figures from history. We're all about asking the hard questions and challenging the mainstream narratives. Because history isn't just something that happened in the past. History is something that's constantly being reinterpreted and re-understood as our society changes and evolves. And the stories we tell about history shape how we understand ourselves and our world. Elagabalus' story matters. It matters because it shows us that challenging the status quo has always been part of human civilization. It matters because it shows us the cost of defiance. And it matters because it shows us that even people who are defeated, even people whose memories are erased, can still have a profound impact on history. Thank you for watching. I genuinely hope you found this story as fascinating and thought-provoking as I did, and I hope you'll join the conversation in the comments below, because that's what this channel is really about. Conversation. It's about exploring history together and trying to understand the people who shaped our past and continue to shape our future. So please, subscribe, comment, and let me know what you think. Until next time.